because usually is for is in Italy. It is in Italian most of the times, but in English. And they say if you're watching this on podcast on YouTube, you will see the subtitle. So the we can start. Hello, boomers! Ciao a tutti, ragazzi, and welcome here to Ben Weasel. Ciao, Ben.
Ciao yourself. How you doing?
Bene, bene. Faccio una piccola introduzione, ragazzi. L'intervista naturalmente sarà in inglese. Se la state vedendo su Twitch, se capite l'inglese, molto meglio. Se siete su YouTube potete attivare i sottotitoli, ci saranno i sottotitoli in inglese. Perfetto. Welcome here, Ben Weasel. It's an honor for me to have you here. And first of all, I want to say you thank you for introducing me. You already don't know to Guinness Zero because I
Oh,
saw on your Instagram you drink it. I don't drink alcohol, but I was in Ireland in Dublin and I saw Guinness Zero first time from you. And wow, it's awesome.
yeah, it's good.
Are you into zero beer or just Guinness Zero?
Well, I I haven't been drinking much the past year. It's not. It's just sort of, you know, the older I get, the more I just drink one beer these days, and I just feel like I'm going to fall asleep, and I get into a kind of a cranky mood. So Um, I always, I like the taste. I don't really care about getting a buzz or anything. So, but the problem is a lot of those non-alcoholics are not very good. But Guinness Zero is one of the really good ones, one of the
Yes,
best
exactly.
ones.
I was in Dublin, and wow, it is a town of Guinness Zero, and I really, really enjoyed it. Thanks to your Instagram feed, I've been introduced. I didn't know that Guinness are doing the zero version. Very good.
Yeah, good. Well, I'm glad to hear it.
So, Ben, if you are here with me, walking distance from here, we can arrive in around half an hour to Igia Marina when I saw you for the last time here in Italy for your first show with Screeching Weasel at Bayfest.
Oh yeah.
So, yeah, it's really, really close from here. We can walk
Oh
to
good.
to the place where you play. Do you remember something in particular about your first show in Italy? Or
Yeah, it was great. We were in the hotel right on the beach there, and which was real nice. Had a beautiful view, and the hotel staff was excellent. The food was great. The
Hotel Hermitage? Well, my friends used to run that hotel, so let's say
Oh
hello to him.
yeah, I mean they treated us really well, um, and the promoters were great also, although there was kind of, I was a little off from the time change. So we came in the day before we played, and during the day that we were set to play, I guess I took a nap, and I came down for dinner, and I was kind of out of it. And you meet a lot of people
Yeah.
when you're out on the road. So, and I have a very hard time remembering names. So, what I'll do is I'll see something about the person that that I can use to make me remember who they are, right? So, one of the promoters had her dog with her, and it was a little, what do they call them? Like they used to have them in the U.S. They had ads for Budweiser beer with a character called Spuds McKenzie. It was a dog. It's kind of a bulldog or a Staffordshire Terrier kind of pit bull offshoot. They've got like a bullet face, really distinctive dog, and it was a sweet dog. And and so I remembered her. I think her name was Titi, and I
Titi,
remembered
yes.
her because of the dog, right? So we're sitting at dinner. I've just gotten up, and some people walk by us, and they all say hey, and we're all there, the band and the crew and everything. and they all say, hey, and I'm like, oh, who are you? I haven't met you before. Who are you? Like,
Aspetta,
who was that? And they were like, that's that's the promoter, and then like the promoter's boss. I hadn't met him, but I realized, oh, that's her, and I didn't fucking recognize her because she didn't have her dog with her. I was relying on the dog to always be able to tell that that was her. Because for some reason I thought she probably didn't, but some reason I thought she vaguely resembled the woman who was running the hotel. And I was like, I'm going to get these two confused. So this one, I know TT's always got the dog, but she didn't have the dog. And so I made a complete fool of myself,
You
which is
didn't.
kind of par for the course with me anyway. So I didn't feel too bad about it.
Uh, and what's your feelings about playing Italy after many, many times? Because you arrived in Italy in the second part of your career after many years from the start of your band. So you arrive in new country and you're happy, maybe because your first time playing here, but maybe some regret because maybe I can play here before. What's your
Nah, I
feelings
think
about
it's
that?
okay. I don't have a lot of regrets about the past. I mean, we had, I don't remember who it was, but, I remember years ago, we were making a record, and this was like in the late 90s. We were in the studio making a record, and one of the guys in the band came and said, oh, somebody, some promoter in Italy wants to bring us over, and the money's good and all that. And I said, well, I don't want to think about that right now because I'm making a record. So just tell him to hit us up when we're done with the record in a couple weeks. And then he came back the next day. He's like, no, he needs an answer now. And I was like, oh, he needs an answer now. I told him to wait 2 weeks and he needs an answer now. The answer is no. Just stuff like that. Like we didn't have a booking agent back then. So it's like, you want to come to me and make work for me when I'm in the middle of doing other work. And like, that's going to be the answer. So I don't know. I mean, I think that's just one example of why, one reason why we didn't go over there before. But a lot of it too in those old days was I really didn't enjoy uh, doing the band. I didn't enjoy performing at all, and um, and we did not always get along real well. Those '90s lineups, and uh, and so I didn't really want to go out and do that much stuff. So we would put out a record, and I would feel obligated to go out and tour. But for instance, when we first started doing pretty well in the early 90s, we were with Lookout Records, and they would not give us tour support. And within a year of being on the label, not only would they not give us tour support, but they started charging us up front for copies of vinyl and CDs to sell on the road. So they wouldn't give them to us on consignment anymore because apparently some other band had taken a bunch of stuff on consignment and never paid them. And I was like, well, that wasn't us. We always pay you. It's like, no, that's the new policy. So we had to always come up with a lot of money to be able to just get out on the road because we had to pay to have merch printed up, and we had to pay for our own recorded music up front. So and it was hard to raise that money. So, and then on top of it, we didn't have a booking agent. Like nobody would book us, even when we were doing pretty good and selling, a good amount of records for Lookout. So the live show, there were so many reasons why it was just a huge pain, and I disliked it. And I felt that we were most of the time not a very good live band at that point. And I just really, there was a lot of dysfunction between the band members in those lineups. Whereas now, when you saw us, everything had changed, and it's a bunch of guys who get along, and there aren't any of those problems where you have five different guys with five different agendas.
You
I
are
mean,
from
it's
all
pretty
from
clear that
five
I'm the
different countries,
boss and
right?
I call the shots. What's that?
You are all from five different countries in states here
States. Yeah.
in the U.S. Wow, so it's not so easy to meet now, I guess.
No, but those guys are pros. So they show up when we do a show or a weekend of shows or whatever. They show up and we just go through the set at sound check. Like they'll go through it once or twice without me, and then I'll show up and do a few songs. I can't do too much or I'll lose my voice. But
Okay.
they're always really well rehearsed. So um it works really well right now, and I actually enjoy doing it now. Whereas back in the 90s, it wasn't really fun for me.
In a recent interview, a beautiful interview you did with my friend, I say hi to him, Andrea Rock, a
Yeah,
couple
there's
of
a
months
lot of
ago.
Andreas in Italy, aren't there?
Yes,
Yeah.
Andrea Cantelli, Andrea Magis. If you enter in a club and say, "Hi, Andrea," everybody says like that. Okay. We're born in the same period and it was a really, really fashion trend, that name. And you say that you don't like to travel. So you probably really, really enjoyed this period because it's the last couple years. Maybe your last show is from 2019 and one show in 2019 and a couple of albums. So I guess you are really
Yeah,
enjoying
I
that
mean,
period.
you're not supposed to admit it, but I've enjoyed the hell out of it because I've I've really increased my creative work. It's funny because we had started to slow down, like you said, before the pandemic hit. Like in 2019, like you said, we did one show, and the year before that, we only did two. We went out and did like Seattle and Portland. So we had been slowing down, and that was by design. I was just getting really, really tired of traveling. But having said that, when we were out, before then, if we were doing like 4 or 5 weekends a year, what people don't realize is like even when we had a manager, which during some of those years we did, a lot of that work fell to me. And so it wasn't just like, oh, I'm going to get on the plane and go out and play some shows and come home and that's that. Like I would have a lot of work to do beforehand and a lot of work to do, when I got back, that's about a solid week of work. And so I really enjoyed not having that on my mind at all. And just saying I can sit down and do nothing but write songs and work on a novel. I was writing screenplays. Like I just had a creative explosion. And I'm still doing that. And I love it. I mean, that's what I always wanted to do. I always wanted to write. I didn't really care about performing. I wasn't really a performer. I was a writer. So, so yeah, I really enjoyed it. And I mean, you can see, we had two albums come out within a relatively short amount of time. One at the beginning of the pandemic, and one, like a couple months ago. And that's just a function of having, so much time and space, really, like mental space to sit down and go, I can take my time and work on this and not have as many other things popping up and distracting me.
Even because now the records, the last couple records, are almost self-released because, of course, Andrea and Striped print you vinyls, but is almost DIY for your band, so you don't have
Yeah,
any pressure. And I feel, and I guess, is very very different the your approach now between the past for making a new record. Maybe you are more free. You feel more free now, or you have always an artistic direction?
I do. I mean, when we started out, that was kind of how things were, although even our first record, we were with a label, but we had done some self-release stuff and so forth. And it is a big difference, but the main thing for me is I really like to own my masters. I don't like the idea of other people owning my records. And and the rights to them. So, and now with, the way the music industry has changed, or the recorded music industry, if you owning your masters is more valuable maybe than it used to be, or more important than it used to be. So that's the main thing. The downside to it is it's a lot more work, and you also have to fund everything yourself. So it really comes down to, the reason we were able to do a new album so fast was, as I said, one, I had the time to do the work, and the other thing though was that the previous album did well enough that I was able to take some money and put it towards doing another one. So, because it's not ridiculously expensive, but it's a fairly expensive proposition to fund the recording of your own album if you want to do it properly. And that it can be hard to raise that money.
What's your writing routine in approaching new songs? You have a routine? I guess so, because you write in a little amount of time, and how you practice together, living in different places. For the music to put to bring in the studio.
Well, I mean, to answer your second question first, it's all remote. I mean, with the internet
All
now,
remote.
you don't need to get together and rehearse, um, because people can hear the stuff and kind of work out their parts on their own. But I, to the extent that I have a routine, it's really, there is no routine during times like this when there aren't solid plans to make a record. But when I start thinking, okay, I'm kind of going over stuff maybe that didn't make it onto previous records, or stuff that I never got around to finishing, and I start thinking, okay, I think I've got the basis of an album here, then I'll go to our producer, Mike Kennedy, who is also
That
now,
is a guitar player of your band.
yeah, he's also playing guitar in the band now, as of the last record. So I'll go to Mike and say, hey, what do you think? Do we have a good starting point here? And if he says yes, which is what happened with the last record, then I will start trying to make it better, which means, like if I have an album worth of songs and he says, yeah, this is pretty solid, this is pretty much ready to go, then I'll say, okay, let's make it better. Let's make this harder. Let's make us really have to choose between, a larger number of songs. And hopefully the songs are good enough that there are some tough decisions that have to be made. So at that point, I'll sit down and deliberately write. And that takes a lot of different forms. Like sometimes I keep a list of song titles, and I will look at that and kind of go, okay, do any of them fit any of the stuff I've worked on? Or can I take a title and just write from it, and say, can I come up with a cool song based on this title, and, maybe make that a lyric or something. Another thing that I did on the last record was I said, I think we need a specific type of song for the first song on the record. Your opener should really grab your attention. So I sat down and wrote 6 Ways to Sunday, which was written to be the first song on the record. Similarly, the song Tell Me Your Lies was written to be the last song on the record, which it is. I also sat down and said, okay, I've got a bunch of songs here that are kind of dark, that are lyrically going into things like the apocalypse and insanity,
Yes,
and
lot of dark topics are around in this album.
pardon me.
A lot of dark topics and dark
Yeah,
songs about this album that are inside.
exactly. So what happened is I said, okay, I've got a lot of these songs and I want to balance them out a little bit, and I want to write some really like over the top poppy ones. And so I sat down and did that. And a lot of people think that including a lot of songwriters, think it's just sheer inspiration. You've got to kind of sit around until the muse leads you into something. And I don't subscribe to that notion. It's great when it happens, but if you sit around waiting for it to happen, you're not going to get much work done. So I like to sit down, and if I've got no particular idea, I'll just sit down and strum a chord. And then from that chord, I'll try to come up with a melody, and that will tell me where the chord progression is going to go. Sometimes I will just, a melody will pop into my head. And based on that melody, I will start writing a song in my head, and then go and get the guitar and do some voice memos. Sometimes, and this happens, kind of frequently, I will dream a song. And I'll hear a song in a dream, and I'll always think it's by such and such band, and then I wake up and realize it's not, and it's my own song. Sometimes I don't dream it, but I'm like falling asleep and almost asleep, and I get a tune in my head, and I got to drag myself out of bed and go do it. So there's a lot of different ways it can happen, and I find that when you sit down with the express purpose of kind of finishing an album or writing for an album, then then that thing that people wait for, that inspiration that people wait for, that kind of will happen as a result of work. I mean, the cure to not being able to write is to write.
You've been a music producer yourself, and how is it to have a music producer in the band? Is not you? How you work together? How do you relate with Mike as a producer?
Yeah, well, I mean, I was never really any good at it. I think I did a pretty good job with like the last Riverdale's record, but but I mean, that didn't require much either. So, Mike is really good at production, and we work together, I think, really well, because he he's a fan first and foremost. Before we started working together, he was a fan, and had been since he was a teenager. And so he knows my songs, and he knows what I'm good at. So because I know that about him, and because, when I first worked with him, I saw and heard firsthand what he was doing with my songs. He took them and made them better, right? And in demo form. And he tweaked the arrangements, and he added really cool instrumentation, and he made suggestions about things. And, I don't always agree with him, but by and large, he's right. And he knows what he's talking about. So, and the important point is, if you're in that situation where a guy knows your strengths and weaknesses and is a fan of yours, then you can get to a point, as I did very quickly with Mike, where I trust him. That's a very important element of the relationship with the producer. Do you trust that the producer is not that he doesn't have his own agenda, but his agenda is the same as yours, which is to make the best record possible? And part of that entails you, as the artist or writer or singer, you have to step back and say, wait a second, I can't let my ego get the best of me. I have to do the same thing that I want him to do, which is to make the best record we can make. That if we were Screeching Weasel fans, this is a record we would want to hear. But once you establish that trust, then it becomes really easy and smooth. So we can go through these things, and we'll have our disagreements here and there, but we can go through these songs and kind of figure things out, and decide which are going to be on the record, and which maybe, for a variety of reasons. Maybe this song didn't make it because there's already 3 other songs that are kind of in that same wheelhouse or whatever. And you might, disagree about that, but it ends up working out really well, and the other guys in the band love working with him because he's so easygoing. They know his goal is to get you to sound as great as you can sound and to contribute to the band something that only you can bring to the table. And he's got a really I think relatively rare knack for doing that, for kind of pinpointing what somebody's really good at and maximizing that to make the whole song better. Like, I'm going to take what you are best at with as a drummer or a bass player, and I'm really going to focus on that and squeeze the absolute best out of you that I can. And I think he's done that on all our records, but especially on the last two records. I mean, he's really gotten great performances out of all of us. And I know, going and doing vocals, I've never had an easier time doing vocals with any engineer or producer ever. It's a pleasure. It doesn't even feel like work.
Is the focus you just said, the last two records, is about that I want to talk because I really, really enjoyed both albums, and most of people and reviews are very, very good. But probably, in my opinion, that album deserves more promotion because you did some really good album, but maybe most of people now there are that didn't know there are the album out. Probably you need more promotion and. What do you think about that? Because okay, the idea is to spread your music how much you can.
Well, I mean, it's a difficult thing.
Yeah.
It's ironically, I think, harder to promote a record now than it was before the internet, and it should be the opposite, but I think it's actually harder. It's easier to reach your hardcore fans,
Yes, of
but
course.
for the fans who aren't constantly checking your social media or whatever, it can be very hard to reach them, and because all the social media outlets are set up to maximize profits, which means they want to set up their algorithms in such a way that you're hidden from your fans unless you pay, and that can be difficult when you don't really have a budget for it. So it's tricky, but um, we have done really well with these records financially, so I try not to worry about it too much. I
Okay.
think, you know, I think you're probably right, but it's also something that's really out of my control. I mean, I think, the labels that are involved, like from Striped to Rumbar, who does the CDs in the US, and occasionally we work with Recess in the US. I mean, I think they do what they can. They put what they can towards it, but at the same time, they're smaller labels and there's only so much that they can do. So it's it's a constant um, shift, and you've got to ask yourself, sometimes, well, would I be better off on a bigger label? And uh, you know, I've come to the conclusion that that's not for me and my band. I mean, I've done that. I've been on bigger independent labels, and there have been some really good things about it. And it's not like I had terrible experiences doing it. But as I said earlier, I really like owning my own masters. I like knowing that when I die, uh, that will go to my children. And
Many
um,
artists in the United States are selling their entire catalog. What you thinking about that in the music industry? Now the new trend, even Joy Ramone family sold the catalog, and so you think opposite of that.
Well, I think what they're talking about is publishing. So they're not, because a band like the Ramones doesn't own their own masters. The record labels own the masters. So I think what they're talking about is the publishing, and there are some misunderstandings about that. If I am correct about this, and I'm reasonably sure I am, what we've seen with these news stories, these I don't know if they're venture capital firms or what they are, but these big companies are coming in and buying up these catalogs, usually of older artists. And what they're buying doesn't mean that, as far as I know, it does not mean that the artists are never making any more money off of it other than what they get as a lump sum, because I believe what they're buying is the publishing side of the songs for those artists that own it. I may be wrong about that. They may be buying the songwriter's side, but there are two sides in publishing. There's the publisher's side, and there is the songwriter's side. And so what happens often with like bands on major labels is they sign away their publishing side to the record label or to a company that comes along and offers them an advance. And so the result is, if, for instance, they get a licensing opportunity, say in a film or a TV show, to use one of the songs, then whatever money that comes in from that, the publishing company, this is theoretical, the publishing company would get roughly half, and they would get half because for the fee, because there are two licenses. It doesn't always work that way. Sometimes the publishing company will hold out for more and the artist will take less, but usually they'll have what is called a most favored nations clause, where you say, whatever you pay the publisher, you've got to pay me, right? So you will still get paid, but half that money is going to the publisher. And similarly, if that gets a bunch of airplay on TV and whatnot, then you will earn royalties from the publishing society with whom you're associated. In America, that would be ASCAP or BMI, most likely. And again, that is a roughly 50-50 split between the publisher and the songwriter. Well, in our case, we own our own publishing. Okay. So somebody could theoretically come to us and say, we want to buy your publishing, we'll give you this amount of money for it. The downside to that is that you have no control over licensing at that point. So this company puts out a bunch of money to you, and obviously they want to recoup that investment. So that means if they want to use your song in a hemorrhoid commercial, you don't have any say in it. Okay. They're going to do it, and the
example,
other thing is
the song Volare, you probably know.
Yeah, of course.
In a commercial of spaghetti, and there's an actress handing spaghetti and say Volare. It screams, of course, and okay, it's not. It's like desecration for me, but
I mean, at the same time, we need to eat. And so I understand why people do it. And I wouldn't, if somebody came, at one point we didn't get the gig, but at one point somebody inquired about putting us in like a Doritos commercial in South America. And I was like, hell yeah, go ahead and do it. I mean, it was good money.
Okay.
But, the thing is, if you're a younger artist or a newer artist, I think it's a really bad idea to sell your publishing. And the reason is you're betting against yourself. And I think it's always, if you're betting against yourself, you need to stop and ask yourself why you're even doing this, right? Because you're taking a short-term payday, and if you do well, you're going to regret it in the long run, because you would have made probably so much more money than they're going to offer you. But if you're, Bob Dylan or, some of these other people who are older and have already made a lot of money, then it might make sense to sell your publishing. Even if what they're selling is maybe the songwriter side, which I don't know, because none of these articles ever go into it, probably because the people who write the articles don't really understand what they're writing about. But for us, we work with a publishing administrator, and they make sure that we get paid what we're supposed to get paid, and they maximize our ability not only to do the best we can with our song publishing from a songwriter's point of view, but also from a publisher's point of view. And and so I have seen firsthand how valuable that is. Because if somebody comes to me and says, for instance, like they did on the last 2 albums, and said, okay, we want to use these songs in a movie. Okay, there's a movie coming out this year that has like 2 songs from the new album and one from the previous one, and then one from the Wiggle album from the 90s. So they said, well, we want to use those. Well, we now get, we are now in control of both those licenses. They have to obtain 2 licenses, a master use license for the recording of the song, and what they call a synchronization license, which is what gets paid to songwriters for the song as a piece of intellectual property, I guess. What that effectively means is we make twice the money. Whereas we've had a couple other gigs in the past year where people have come to us and said, we want to use this song and it's a cover song. And it's like, well, if it's a cover song, we don't make anything from the sync license. If we own the master, then yeah, that money comes in. But, or if they come and say, we want something like Cool Kids, which is on Fat Records, Fat Records owns that master. Now, a master use is different from publishing. I know you didn't ask for a lecture on all this, but it's if you want to understand better what's going on. So Fat doesn't own our publishing, but they do own the master. Okay. So when it comes to the license, they will get that fee for the master use, and we'll get the fee for the sync. But because we own our publishing, when that thing generates more money through replays on streaming and whatnot, then we get both the publisher and the sync money. It's confusing, and it's confusing by design. I think the music industry is set up to confuse musicians and artists, because if they're confused, you can take advantage of them. But the long and the short of it is, it's from my perspective and where I'm at, it makes more sense to own and control as much of that as possible, because the only way you can make real money in recorded music this day, if you're a band like us, is through those licensing opportunities. So if you have maximized your ownership of songs and masters, then when somebody licenses a song, you're going to get every piece of that pie instead of like half of it.
You live so many eras of the music industries. In crossing 35 years, you start from the vinyl, then to CD, to the Napster era, vinyl again, streaming,
yeah, back to vinyl,
YouTube, Spotify. It's not easy to understand at the beginning a new trend. What's the most difficult part in whole this different you lived on with your band?
I mean, I would say probably the streaming thing has been the most radical change. And the reason for that, I mean, obviously it's been a radical change in a business sense, but it's also radically changed how people listen to music. The other formats that you're talking about, those were pretty small incremental changes relatively compared to the streaming change, because the streaming thing kind of destroyed the concept of an album, because you don't, the effort that you have to make to not listen to a record is very small. If you were listening to a vinyl record and you said, well, I heard 3 songs, now I want to listen to something else, you had to get up, you had to take the needle off, you had to take the record off, you had to put another record on. And the same with the CD. But with this, you can just kind of flip around at random. I look at how my teenage daughter listens to music, and for her, everything is playlists. so we've gone back in a way to like the 50s where it's a very singles based
Yes.
um, experience for most people, and there's not necessarily anything wrong with that. I mean, I personally don't like it, but that's because I grew up listening to albums. Albums influenced me musically and songwriting wise. I think of music in terms of albums. I think of a collection of songs as being more than just a random collection of songs. I really believe strongly, and I started to really focus on this when we did the Anthem for a New Tomorrow record. I really believe strongly in getting a loose but reasonably unifying theme going on a record. And I like the art of the jacket art to work with the songs, and I like the production and the instrumentation to work with the songs. Like everything, there have to be for me certain threads running through a record in order for me to be really happy with it and to feel like I did something worth listening to. Having said that, I'm aware that that's not necessarily the best, and it's certainly not the only way for people to listen to music. That's just my preference. And so when I make records that way and people don't listen to them that way, I feel that they're missing out a little bit because they're not really getting the full experience that I'm trying to give them. But at the same time, I mean, if they really like 3 songs on the record and they want to throw them in a playlist and maybe not listen to the other ones, it's really not up to me to tell them they can't or they shouldn't. So um, I'm not necessarily saying. I mean, I would definitely defend the album model. I think it's a superior model, but I'm not really at the same time saying there's anything wrong with people kind of listening to music the way they do now. The only real downside to it, in my opinion, is the tendency, and I see this in myself because I stream mostly. Um, it's the tendency to not give things a fair chance because you're paying a monthly fee at most for unlimited music essentially. And so if something doesn't hit you right away, boom, you go on to the next one. So I find a lot of times I'm not really giving things a fair chance. Whereas in the days when I was buying records, if it didn't hit me on the first listen, by God, I would listen to it again and again. I would
And
listen to it a
again.
bunch of times before I gave up on it because I paid good American money for it. You know, I wanted to make sure that I knew there was nothing worth listening to on here. So, I mean, I remember when I got it was 1983 when the Black Sabbath album came out with Ian Gillan from Deep Purple on vocals, Born Again. And
Yes.
I was like, oh man, this is pretty much shit. There's like one good tune, maybe two. This is just terrible. I wish I hadn't bought this record. But you know, I listened to it a lot and I found some things to like about it. And even now, I listened to it recently after having not heard it for decades. And I was like, yeah, you know, this isn't a great record, but there's some really good stuff on it, you know? And I don't know, you know, to me, I think being a good fan means giving a band, whether you're a fan of them or you're just coming to them for the first time, I think it means giving them a fair chance. And so um, if I like a band and they put out a record and I just don't like the record at first, I'm not going to just give up and walk away. I'm going to try. Like you should trust the artist to if they're going somewhere new, you should trust them that they know what they're doing. Sometimes they don't, but you should. I think you should err on the side of trusting the artist, and I don't think we do that so much anymore. We want to. Social media and the internet have trained us to. We want candy. You know, we want that dopamine hit, and if we don't get it right away, by God, we're going to move on to something else. And I just don't think that's good for music fandom. I don't think it's good for creativity for artists. I think it encourages artists to play it safe. So I think there's a lot of downside to that. But I'll say this: the advantage of being in our position where we're not a really big famous band is we don't have to worry about that. We can afford to kind of do what we want because we do have such a loyal fan base that does trust us and that will give us a fair chance. I mean, not all of them, but most of them, and we're really fortunate in that respect.
You talked about talking back to the last album. There's a really really smart question from Tommy Heritage. I changed a little bit. In your opinion, full disclosure, like some Freak of Atavism Part 2, and I see the dark side of some Freak of Atavism. One album is
Yeah,
the dark side of the other.
yeah, a little bit, a little bit. I mean, we did some darker stuff on atavism, and I guess I leaned into it with with awful disclosures because there was definitely some stuff that either didn't make atavism or that I hadn't quite finished writing yet that was more in that vein, in that darker vein. Because you've got songs like that on atavism, like God Help Us. I mean, that would have fit right in on awful disclosures. Um, and if you look at a song like Dead Alive, I mean, that is absolutely and intentionally a sequel to Dead by Dawn. I mean, even down to the song title, but it's literally the same subject matter, and it's just like a part two of that song. So yeah, I mean, I think there's some truth in that. And oh, Zizzy Punk said she's happy to see and hear. Thanks a lot. Thank you.
Thank you,
Um,
Zizi.
so yeah, I think there's something to that. I think you know, in fact, I would say I'm thinking, you know, I'm not writing another record at the moment, but I'm definitely thinking in terms of a trilogy. I don't know why
Okay.
humans always think of trilogies, but I'm definitely thinking in terms of I want to kind of wrap up this, not this era necessarily, but I want to wrap this up with a third album that kind of encompasses maybe everything that's good about the other two and and kind of I'm not exactly sure how it's going to go yet. In fact, that's part of the fun of it is figuring that out as you're writing. You know, one of the great things about creativity is you you have definite intentions when you sit down and write, but often you don't fully understand what you were doing until much later. So you can look
You
at
take a
something from
couple of step back and you can see everything from
that,
another
that's
perspective.
right. That's exactly right. And it's a really kind of neat experience where you can go, oh my God, I didn't even realize this is what I was doing. But based on what I've done since and based on kind of looking at the big picture and looking at all these lyrics, I can see that I was making these connections that at the time were maybe a little unconscious. But at the same time, I think no less deliberate. It's just a deliberateness that maybe isn't that isn't overt necessarily, but that's part of the fun of creativity is there's all this stuff going on that works with the conscious, but also with the subconscious.
A friend of mine are making an interesting question about the new lyrics. Are there any new books that inspired the lyrics of the last album?
Um, I don't think so off the top of my head. I mean, a lot of my reading, you know, I typically read three or four books at once. I mean, not literally at the same
You
time,
don't
but I
mix
will be,
the screenplay between reading three or four
yeah.
books?
I mean, but I'll be reading, you know, like I always have a religious book that I'm reading, and I usually have like a mystery, and then maybe something a little more, you know, literature like. So I'll read two or three, four books at a time, and and certainly that stuff has to um, influence my writing, but I'm not exactly sure how always. So
Not directly, but influence, of course.
yeah, I mean, a good example would be, and it's not just books. So a good example would be the first song on the album, Six Ways to Sunday, which is, roughly based on the ending of the great James Cagney film, White Heat, where if you've ever seen it, I mean, it's a classic film where he's a gangster and he's surrounded by the cops on top of the oil refinery. And he's at top of the world, ma. And he's not going to give up to the cops, and they just have to shoot him down, and the whole thing blows up, and he goes up and so I kind of took that and used that as I guess as a jumping off point or a metaphor for the idea of things like panic attacks. And so, there's definitely, like on the album prior, the song God Help Us was inspired to a pretty large extent by the great Theodore Sturgeon novel, More Than Human. And I wrote another song that hasn't been on an album. It was in a short film a couple years ago called Mister, and that song was called Middle of the Night, and that was based on a really classic horror short story from about 100 years ago called Shambleau by a woman named C.L. Moore. So, I mean, there's definitely stuff that comes up, but being a self-centered songwriter, I often like almost forget about it. So I apologize that I can't answer that question definitively, because once I kind of take it and make it my own, I tend to forget about the influence. So it may be that there is stuff on the new album and I forgot about it.
Wow, thank you. And in the last period, there are some news about some bands that, after many many years, decide to retire. Do you can imagine yourself without the band in the few years, or is a part of your life, and now you are not touring, so you can go on with the band, and you still have a lot of project with the band going through the future?
Yeah, I mean, I'm really enjoying it right now, and I love the guys I work with. They're good people. They're great musicians. They're real easy to work with. Everybody gets along. When we, like you said earlier, it's five guys living in five different states, and so when we get together, it's like a little reunion. Everybody's happy to see each other, and it's a really enjoyable experience now. Um, and I'm so happy with the work that they've done on the past couple albums. Well, the past few albums, really, um, that I want to do more. I mean, I really feel rejuvenated, and like we've got a lot more that we can do. Um, and I would like to get to playing, some shows again. I don't, want to go full tilt. I'm never going to go out on tour again
Of
for like
course.
a long length of time, but I would like to play a little bit more, maybe do some weekend runs here again, like we
Like
were doing.
MXPX right now, they do just with a weekend run, and I
Yeah,
guess it's more easy than going for on a full tour.
that's right. And we share an agent actually with MXPX. So it's doable. That's a model that both they and us have used extensively in the past, and it's doable. It just became really hard during the pandemic and in the wake of the pandemic for a lot of reasons. For a while, promoters, kind of understandably, because they'd been out of business for a while, but they were paying bands less and charging fans more. And now the big issue in America is inflation, because the money
Even
is
here.
actually good now. So the offers that we will get are good. They're fine offers, but we have to take into account the fact that everything is so much more expensive, from van rental and gear rental and hotels and food and everything else. I can't go give my guys the same per diems that I used to, because they're not going to be able to eat, on that money. So everything, becomes so much more expensive, and then you got to go, okay, how do we work that out? So it's a constant game of trying to figure out how to do it. But I really like doing the band now. I mean, for the first time in in I guess it was in 2011 when we got the nucleus of this lineup together. It became really fun for me and really enjoyable for me, and I felt a connection with the fans that I had never felt before. I think a lot of the fans came out, after this debacle at South by Southwest. So many of the fans came out and said, "I want to let you know that I've got your back, and we're here, and we're not going anywhere." And that was really gratifying. And in the wake of that, we were playing to our biggest crowds ever, and this was after having the internet told us we were canceled, and that our career, that they said my career was over. And to go out and not only do well, but to do better than we had been doing before was really, really gratifying. So I felt that connection with the fans, and it's still there. They're really embracing the new music, which I don't care who you are, you want that as a writer. You want people, you understand that people have a real sentimental attachment to your old songs, and that's cool. But you also want them to pay a little bit of attention to the new stuff too, because if you're putting effort into it, which we are, if you're trying to do something that is going to move them and surprise them and make them feel all kinds of things, then it's nice to hear that feedback and to see the people actually streaming the records and buying the records and all that stuff. So at this point, the band is going better than it ever has, and I can't imagine just saying, "Oh yeah, I want to walk away from it." But like I said earlier, my main focus is always the creative work. So I have to balance, how much am I going to work on the road versus how much am I going to do what I think I'm really called to do, which is the writing part of it.
You start a podcast a few years ago, and you are incredible skills of communication. You still run the podcast. How you find yourself in this world, in this new world of podcast?
Well, I mean, the thing is, it was doing okay, but I was spending enough time on it that I felt like, I need to get a little bit of money coming in for this. I don't need to get rich, but so I
Yes.
moved it over to Anchor FM and just told people, hey, it's still free, but you can donate a little if you want. And I got one subscription, one guy, God bless him, for
Well,
99 cents a month. And at that point I said, well, if people think it's not worth paying for, then
yeah.
it's really not worth me doing. I mean, I enjoyed doing it, but my time is really, really, really valuable. And I do not have nearly enough time to do all the creative projects that I have waiting in the wings. And so if I'm going to put any of that work off, then um, I can't do it. I can't justify doing it for free, because if I'm going to do the podcast, I'm going to put some effort into it. I'm going to try and make it really good. It would be one thing if I was just half-assing it, but if I'm trying to make it good and people don't think it's worth money, which is fine. It's not, it's not for me to say. But if they don't think it's worth money, then it's really not worth it for me to do it. Um, so yeah, I stopped doing that.
Okay. Last question before, of course, when I will ask about future show in Italy, who knows,
Oh,
by Dizzy Punk, and then we're going to the finish of the beautiful interview. What kind of music you like to hear, obviously, after punk music
oh well,
in this period?
I mean, I'm not tied to a genre. I mean, I think most music is terrible, but good music is um, can be heard in any genre. So I like I like a lot of the stuff. I haven't listened to a ton of it lately, but I like a lot of the kind of newer jazz stuff on the ECM label out of Germany. This,
ACM label?
ECM, yeah.
Okay.
So like the stuff, a lot of the stuff that they put out is almost like a cross between jazz and indie rock.
Wow.
And I find a lot of that stuff really interesting. I also listen to an awful lot of, I guess, what people would just generally classify as classical music and opera. Um, I especially like Schubert is probably my favorite composer. Beethoven would be a close second, and Bach would be right up there as well. But I like, some of the more modern composers. There's a great American composer, a black woman named Florence Price, who was active in the 20th century. She was from Chicago, and there's been a resurgence of her work recently. So there are some newer recordings of her symphonies and I think like a violin concerto and stuff, because apparently a bunch of her work had been lost and was recently found. And she was like this really great composer who took all these wonderful classical elements, but there's Americana in it as well, and kind of until recently a relatively unknown composer. So it's been really enjoyable to discover her music. Um, and Recently, I read a great biography about the legendary Russian pianist Maria Yudina, and so I've been listening to a bunch of her recordings, and she had a really wide repertoire, but she had a real affinity for Bach, for instance. But she was also a champion of Russian composers, contemporary Russian composers in her time in the 20th century, and so there's a lot of that stuff that I was not familiar with. There's the stuff we all know, like Shostakovich and Prokofiev, but there are also a bunch of composers that maybe aren't as well known. So I like a lot of that stuff, and I think part of the reason I like it is because I can't play that kind of music.
Okay.
Uh, my son can. My son is 11 years old. He's a tremendous uh, piano player for
He
his
also
age.
played the piano in the record.
Yes, he played the keyboards on the record, but he loves Beethoven. Beethoven is his favorite composer, and and he loves Bach and Chopin, and so he's really good at that. But I can't do that, and I think that's part of the reason I will listen to stuff like jazz and classical is because I can't do it. I don't really have any reference for figuring it out. I know the basics. I know about sonata form and things like that, but I'm not a musicologist. And so that allows me to kind of really get into the music in a way that I can't listening to like punk, because with punk it's always like, a lot of it it's like I know all the tricks in the bag, and so it's not very surprising to me. The one record that I heard recently, new record that I guess very loosely falls into the pop punk genre, is the new Haley and the Crushers record,
Okay.
which I believe is called Modern Adult Kicks. And that's a really, really, really good record. But part of the reason it's really good is because it doesn't at all fall into those tropes of the pop punk genre. And but yeah, I really like a lot of the classical stuff because I can just um, relax into it and appreciate it um, without analyzing it.
Wow, Ben, it's really a pleasure to talk with you because you are a person who loves art and you can transmit it. Thank you. Last question, of course, is reasonable to have the chance to see you in Europe? I don't see in Italy in the near future. I guess you you wait for some offer or something like that. Is it able to see you in the near future in Europe?
It's probably not in the near future. I don't think that's something we're going to shoot for in 2023 because
Okay.
we're just trying to kind of get back into the American cities.
Sì, sì, questo sì.
But it's definitely possible. I mean, what it really always comes down to is what is what is the financial situation. So, for instance, earlier I was talking about the issues we have with inflation here. In Europe, it's really the same situation, maybe not with inflation, but Europe is a pretty expensive place compared to America.
Yes.
So a lot of bands look at the offers and they tend to be inclusive offers where promoters will say, look, I'm going to book you in however many cities, and I'm just going to pay you a lump sum. We'll pay for your flights over, we'll pay for your lodging, and then this is the money you're going to get. And I think I have a pretty good reason to believe that most bands don't actually sit down and do the math on that because what happens is some of those countries will charge you taxes, and nobody ever mentions that ahead of time. What you're paying for gas is considerably more than what you would pay for it in America. What you're paying for food is considerably more. I mean, everything is just a lot more expensive. So you what happens is a lot of the most bands will just go, yeah, sounds like a good deal, and then we're the band and people are like, well, why aren't you doing it the way everybody else does it? And it's like, because we're sitting down and with a calculator and actually doing the math on this, and we're realizing that if we went and did a weekend in Germany, we're making less than if we went and did a weekend in Ohio. It just doesn't make sense to travel all that distance and deal with the jet lag and everything to like it just doesn't work out. So typically when we've gone over in the past to Europe, it's been in festival situations because the money tends to be better. It's kind of an in and out where here's your fee. We pay for our own flights and everything. And it's easier to figure out. Whereas when you start getting into things like tours or multiple shows, the European system, and I'm not criticizing it, but the European system is very different from the American system in that there are a lot of middlemen. There are a lot more people that need to be paid in
Yes.
the European system than there are in the US system. And the US system, it's your booking agent going to a promoter. It doesn't really work that way in Europe. And so the money becomes a lot more difficult. And as much as I like playing to the European audiences, because we had a great time when we did the festival in Belgium, when we
I
did the
was
thing in
there at
Italy,
Greuzrock.
yeah, and when we did a show in London with MXPX that was really fun, and we had a ton of people out for that. So I really enjoyed that, but at the same time, it's kind of like I I I got to go where the money is. I got to go where the best
Yes.
deal is for me if I'm going to take my time. Um, and so it's a matter of working out those logistics. But that said, it can work out because it has in the past. But we just got to wait for the right situation. But I'm not opposed to doing it.
Ok. Thank you very much, Ben. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you.
Ragazzi, per chi sta vedendo l'episodio da YouTube, lascio qua sotto il link per comprare l'album su Striped Records. I said that in the podcast, so there will be the link for the Striped to buy the vinyl of
Very,
your last record.
very good.
Thank
Thank
you.
you.
Thank you very much, Ben. It's been a pleasure. And see you guys tomorrow. We have a podcast with Bull Brigade. Grazie, Ben, e grazie a tutti della chat. Ciao, ciao.
Thank you.